ras, 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 ras. Good evening, everyone, both here and if you are watching us online. Thank you for joining us on this hot summer day, and I'm happy to welcome you at the launch of Stone Dreams by Akram Aylisli. And we have three distinguished speakers here. Katherine E, the translator of Akram's work, and also she is a winner of Pushkin House Translation Residency this year. And of course, Katherine is a poet and translator working with numerous authors, including, among others, Anna Starobinets and other Russian and Russophone poets. And she has already translated another book by Akram Aylisli, and this is a standalone publication of his major novel. And with her today is also Thomas de Waal, a senior fellow with Carnegie Europe and a great authority on the Caucasus, and who has also written about Akram's work. And the event is going to be moderated by Fanil Ismailov from BBC Russia. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if we'll need mics, but we used to mics. I used to the radio and used to TV. I understand that. Yeah. So, well, thank you very much for inviting me here as a moderator. I do it the first time in my life, or maybe the last time in my life. But it's a great honor, to be honest, to be talking about this book about Akram Aylisli himself, whom I'm honored to know personally from my years as a journalist in Baku in the mid and late 80s, early 90s. And we met a few times, we discussed different things, but all of us at that time had one feeling about what's happening around us, and it was shock. And it took time before the intelligentsia of Azerbaijan and intellectuals managed to actually think it through and understand what is going on, because the events that started in 1988 and probably even started slightly earlier, but we only saw them happening from 1988 onwards, were like a huge tsunami, a perfect storm that engulfed everyone, and everything that we lived up to that point, all the values, all the understanding, what's going to happen to us, what's going to happen to our country, just went down with a huge bang, and a new life, a new history has started. And in that new history, we had to make our choices. So when I read Akram Aylisli's book, I very much imagine what I saw around me. I totally know, although I understand this is literature, these are characters in the book, but I sort of recognize them because I sort of saw a bit of that person and a bit of that person around me. I knew personally Haydar Aliyev, the president who came later on, though, but I also could see people who were leading the national movement, the People's Front of Azerbaijan, and I could see journalists and actors, and I could see what's happening with them, with theater. I could see what's happening to my editorial office. I used to work at that time in a party newspaper called Vishka, which got nothing to do with the Russian word, but also means derrick, as in oil rig. And that's why the book and the way that Akram Aylisli saw the events unfolding is close to me, to my heart. Of course, we know that the book was controversial and different people saw different things in it. But I think what we're gonna discuss that because you cannot avoid it. And that's we're here with Catherine, who actually went to the literary side of the book, and Tom, who is an absolutely distinguished expert on the events that unfolded around Azerbaijan-Armenian relations in 1988 onwards, and written books about it. And I, as a journalist, can tell you that if there are few experts on the Karabakh War and Armenian-Azerbaijani relations, I think Tom is at the top. So I'm not flattering you. It's just it's a fact. I would start with Catherine, if you don't mind. How was it chosen? I mean, how come you came across this book as a translator and as a commission to you to, you know, can you look at this book and can it be translated, and how you went about it?
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you and with everybody here to talk about this book, because this is such a cool story. I got an email from Natasha Perova, the agent and sometime publisher in Moscow. It must have been the summer of 2014, saying, every time I tell the story, I tell it slightly differently, but it was something along the lines of, I know you're up for a challenge, or I know you love a lost cause. And what was happening was she and other of Akram Aylisli's friends in Moscow, of whom there is a rather large contingent, were looking for somebody to get his story out. And the person I ended up mostly being in touch with was Shura Burton, the journalist who had gone to Baku to interview Akram Aylisli after the burning of his books and after the considerable controversy about this book. And then he traveled on to Aylis, the village where this book is set, and wrote about those travels. And so, so I suddenly had a very interesting project and no money at all. And that started a long journey to try to get funding to pay for the translation. In general, books that are translated from Russian over the last 10 years or so, most of the money has come from the Institute Perievoda in Moscow in the form of subsidies to publishers, which has been very nice for those of us who translate from Russian. That's now changed, of course. But that money is really only available for translations of, shall we say, Russian literature. And this was not Russian literature. This was a book originally written in Azeri. It's never, as far as I know, been published in Azerbaijan in Azeri, and it was published by Akram Aylisli in December of 2012 in the magazine Drushba Narodov, the Russian magazine, and then subsequently issued in a Russian language edition. There was also a very tiny edition published in Baku in Russian, I think in 2011, I think only 50 copies in Russian. But this book is not available in Azeri, although it has been translated by people seeking to smear the author into Azeri. But there's no authorized edition in Azeri. So it's, insofar as this, there is an authorized edition. It's in Russian. Akram Aylisli translated it himself. And I worked from that translation. So that's how it came into English. So in terms of how are we going to get it funded, because for books being translated in the United States, which is where this publisher is, the biggest single cost of paying for a translation is paying the translator. And in my case, I was very lucky, since I couldn't get money from the Russian government, since it wasn't a Russian citizen and it wasn't a Russian language book from Russia. I applied to the National Endowment for the Arts in the United States, and they very kindly supported the publication of the book, and I got really lucky. You only get one of those every 10 years, so that was my, I was lucky, and I could apply again, I think, in another 7 years for another book. But anyway, so, and then I had to go find a publisher, for people in America, Azerbaijan is a very, very, very long way away, it took some doing, but we found a small publisher out of Boston, Academic Studies Press, that was interested in the book. And the book that we published then is this book, Farewell Aylis, which is the book that we're speaking about tonight, Stone Dreams, is part of a trilogy. And this book, the larger book, contains the entire trilogy, which starts with the novella Yemen from about 1990. And then Stone Dreams, I think, was written in about 2008. And the final novella in this collection is called A Fantastical Traffic Jam. That was written a little bit later, 2010, 2011. And finally, this book contains an essay by Akram Aylisli in which he talks, among other things, about what it was like to watch his books being burned in his hometown on the internet. And they were burned in February of 2013. So Stone Dreams is, again, the second novella. It's the one that's most, shall we say, well-known. It's been published in a number of European languages. It was a finalist for the German Booker Prize. It's about to come out, I believe, in French, and it's about to come out in Georgian. And I know of somebody in Japan who's interested in translating it. So it really is making its way around the world.
But there's a difference between the text in the bigger book with the 3 novellas and the novella itself, which is a separate publication.
Right, there is a slight difference. You know, translators do their work, they send it out in the world, and they hope they got it right. And then every once in a while you think, I really didn't get that right. So there was a section, there's a dream section, which we'll see a little bit of later tonight, that I went back and re-examined when this standalone volume was coming out, and the tenses are different. So that's important to me as a translator, probably not important to the reader.
You know, for me as a reader, although, as I said, I grew up in that, I saw this happening in front of my eyes, but the book itself, when I was reading it, it didn't feel like it's a historical account of what was happening, and it's not. It cannot be, as War and Peace of Leo Tolstoy is not the account of 1812 Napoleonic Wars, but many things that I could see there were something very close to my heart, because the quest of the main character to go back to his roots, to his father's village, and do something extraordinary, something new, something that will put his name and the history of his father's village among his brethren, is something that I had to go through myself, because my father wanted me to go back to his village and to write about the village. And here comes Famil, a sort of Moscow-educated student, who wants to write about what's happening in Baku, the corruption, the young people's problems, you know, and what's happening around him. And then the Karabakh conflict comes along, and he goes out on those to report from the demonstrations, from the rallies, and it's not exactly what you see. But that quest, I think, it's a fulfillment probably of Akram's father's dream, for Akram to write a dream for his character who returns to his village in Aylis. But how did you see the development, the plot developing in the book? How easy it was for you? Was it a challenge?
So first of all, I want to say something about the question of village and what the father might have wanted for him. You know, Akram Aylisli's father died in the Second World War when he was a very, very small child, and he didn't really know his father. And he was raised almost entirely by women, which I think is a fascinating thing when you look at his work as a whole, because his portrayals of women are very sensitive. They're very, very interesting. And there's an earlier set of novellas, People and Trees, which was written in the 1960s, but it's set immediately during and after the Second World War in Aylis. And the main characters are largely women, and putting himself in the shoes of these women who had just undergone collectivization, Sovietization in the 20s, and then in the 40s, all the men disappeared to fight, and there was another upheaval in society. So he was looking at the world through really unusual perspectives. I mean, being raised by women and thinking about their lot in life. In terms, though, of the village itself, it's present in every one of his works that I've looked at. Sometimes it has a slightly different name, but it's always a place of refuge, a place where the elders live, a place of wisdom. And it's almost, for me, it's like Akram Aylisli's muse, you know, to think about this place that's always present in all of the books, no matter what they're ostensibly about. There is generally something about the light of the mountains lying on this village in the Ordubad region of Nakhchivan that's really, really special and unique, and I hope we'll get to read a passage about that tonight. Did I answer your question?
Absolutely. I've been talked about. I've been to Nakhchivan, I've been to Nigram, and I've been to some other place in there, the salt mine, was the place I was, but not in Aylis, and I can only imagine how beautiful it is. What was the piece that you were talking about? you wanted to read.
Shall I read the first
Oh, yes,
part of
go
the first
ahead,
chapter?
by all
All
means,
right.
yes.
So I'm going to set the stage a little bit. We are in the very last weeks of the year 1989, and we are just about to have the very bloody anti-Armenian pogroms in Baku in the beginning of 1990. But we're still a little bit prior to that. It's a day in December, and a very tall, thin stranger is brought to the hospital, bloody and unconscious. And the first chapter takes place in a Baku hospital. And the person who brought this tall, thin man named Sadai Sadigli is a small, fidgety man named Nuvarish Karabakli. And he has an enormous round belly and a rather funny face. And so he goes to the hospital with this man and listens as the doctors sort of bring him in and examine him. And we're about to start with, the doctor has just been saying all of the things that are wrong. Fortunately, his skull is not fractured, but many, many other things are broken. After every word the doctor said, the face of the man who'd brought the patient reflected all his feelings, all his pain and suffering. With difficulty, he held himself together so as not to burst out sobbing. When the doctor had finished his exam, the man's self-possession was also at an end. He wept violently, like an aggrieved child. The eyes of one of the women in the white lab coats standing beside the operating table, the younger one, filled with tears. The elderly nurse was also upset and shook her head woefully. And the doctor was very sorry for the man. He began to calm him. There, this isn't good. It's nothing terrible. In 15 days, your friend will be like new. I'll make a beauty out of him. Lowering his head, he thought a bit, and then again lifted his head and asked cautiously, so you say this man is Armenian? The eyes of our comic hero bulged in surprise. Really? You don't know him? You don't know Sadai Sadigli, the pride of Azerbaijani theater, our #1 artist? You really don't know this great master, doctor? You haven't even seen him on television? You've even seen me on television more than once, doctor. Maybe you just don't remember. Nuvarish Karabakli, a well-known actor of comic roles. Maybe you don't know me. I'm not offended by that. But there's no one who doesn't know Sadai Sadigli. You see, no one else in the world has played Hamlet, Othello, Aiden, and Kefli Iskender like he has. I recognized you immediately, said the young nurse with unconcealed pride. I've often seen the two of you on television, said her elderly colleague, for some reason a bit coquettishly. But Dr. Farzani isn't to blame. He lived more than 30 years in Moscow, and it hasn't been 3 years since he returned to Baku. Understanding now why the doctor didn't recognize him or Sadai Sadigli, the artist calmed down at once. And that the nurses, having recognized them immediately, hadn't let on, Nuvarish Karabakli put down to the fact that they'd certainly feared the information would have been poorly received by the doctor. Nuvarish Karabakli guessed that all his words had gone in one of the doctor's ears and out the other. Either the doctor had been too immersed in his thoughts, or else he, Nuvarish Karabakli, had been unable to find the necessary words in his nervous state. Therefore, he tried to focus as much as possible and resolved to recount everything that had happened on the parapet again, more simply and basically. It was like this, doctor. Today, I was walking about the city. What time it was, I can't say exactly. Maybe 10, maybe 11. On the parapet, there's a place with a fountain. You've probably seen it. And suddenly, a terrible shriek came from there, as if someone was howling. It turns out it was an old Armenian. He'd gone out to buy bread, and there he fell into the hands of the Yaratsi. The Yaratsi is a gang of youths, right in his housecoat and slippers. When I got to the place, the unfortunate man was already dead and had been thrown into the pool. But his eyes were open, doctor, and he was looking straight at me. I personally didn't see how they killed him. The people who were there earlier said that at first they threw the Armenian into the pool, right into the frozen water. He was an old man. He couldn't stay in the water. He wanted to climb out. And those guys were standing at the edge of the pool, kicking him until they kicked him to death. And Sadai Sadigli, God help him, always has trouble circling around his head. Otherwise, how could he have been the one to show up at that moment in that cursed place? He couldn't hold back. That's what happened. He's an artist, a humane person. His heart couldn't bear it. He ran to help. And how could those Yuratsi know who and what he is? They've just arrived. They're not from here. So they took him for an Armenian and attacked like wild animals. If I'd been just a minute later, they'd have sent him to join the old Armenian. But God spared him. He remained alive. I beg you, doctor, save him. The life of that great person is now in your hands. With these pathetic words, the artist finished his speech. The doctor hurried to start the operation, but it seemed that some necessary item was missing. Besides, the story of the artist had apparently shaken him. He didn't see anything particularly unusual in the fact that the Hamlet Othello Kefli Iskender, lying unconscious on the operating table, had been trying to save an old Armenian. In the doctor's opinion, anyone who considered himself a human being would have behaved the same way. However, the inhabitants of the city, as if they'd come to an understanding about it, were trying to steer clear of what's called humaneness. It seemed it was no longer even worth their while to pretend to be human beings. Just 10 or 15 days previously, in that same operating room, Dr. Farzani had performed a very complicated operation on an Armenian girl of 14 or 15 who, by God knows what miracle, had been brought to the hospital. In the metro, where it's always full of people, a few Azerbaijani women had attacked her and, watched by hundreds of people, inflicted savage punishment. And just a few days before that, some poet degenerate had burst into the hospital and beaten up a doctor who'd worked in the cardiology department for 40 years, driving him out of his office just because he'd had the misfortune to be born Armenian. After that, not a single Armenian remained at the hospital, neither doctors nor members of the supporting staff. Some had hidden at home, some had left Baku forever. Numaish mualam, it's as the Persians say, mesele melum est, the issue is clear, said the doctor in a cheerful voice that was not at all in concert with his obvious bad mood, shifting his surgical instruments. Nuvarish Karabakli wasn't offended that the doctor had mangled his name. A person who'd lived more than 30 years in Moscow had full right to do that. But he didn't fail to correct him. Who is Nuvarish Karabakli, doctor, he said. An ordinary actor. Hundreds of Nuvarish Karabaklis aren't worth the little finger of Sadai Sadigli. It would have been better if those scoundrels had beaten me in his stead. Is he also from Karabakh? Asked the doctor, checking the patient's pulse again. No, of course not, doctor. I'm not from Karabakh either. Karabakli is just my stage name. I'm originally from Kurdamir. And Sadai Sadigli was born in Nakhchivan, a place in the Ordubad region, the village of Aylis. A very ancient village, doctor, although I've never been there myself. They say at one time many Armenians lived there. It seems 7 or 8 of their churches are standing there to this day. Apparently those Armenians were very smart, good people. And Sadai Sadigli is the kind of person, doctor, that even if the world turned upside down, he wouldn't call white black. He's suffered for his outspokenness many times already, but he hasn't learned anything. In a couple of months, he'll turn 50, but he remains a 10-year-old boy. He says what's on his mind. He can't even occasionally be silent, even in such dangerous times. He says it's not the Armenians, but we ourselves who are bad. And he isn't afraid. He says it everywhere, all the time, in the theater and in the tea rooms. Dr. Farzani, his eyes widening, looked at the patient's face, this time with a kind of special interest. It was as if he'd just now seen him for the first time. The women, who'd been preserving a dead silence, suddenly began whispering in a lively way about something. Farzani took Nubarish Karabakli firmly by the arm and leading him to the door said, "Well, young man, there's nothing more for you to do here. Go sit in the corridor, rest. And if you want, go home, drink a shot of vodka as needed, and topple into bed. Then come back if you want to. This isn't cutting out an appendix, my friend. A full overhaul is necessary here, which will take 3 or 4 hours. Don't worry. Your friend will live. I'll make such an Othello of him that Desdemona will faint with joy." With those words, the doctor escorted the artist into the corridor and closed the door behind him.
I love Dr. Farzani, my favorite character. We have a recording of Akram Aylisli reading from his book, and we'll come back to it. But I think the excerpt that we just heard brings us very nicely to the controversy of the book. And here I turn to Tom, because Tom, just in February this year, met Akram Aylisli in Baku. How is he?
Sure. Well, also very glad to be with you this evening to talk about this wonderful book and this wonderful writer. And I'm very glad to see the book now in this new edition. Yes, I mean, obviously, let's just take a few steps back and see why this book is so important, and also why it was so controversial. Because, you know, suddenly you had in 1988 to 1990 this kind of frozen dispute between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, which had been there in the early 20th century. Two nations living side by side who, for much of their history, you know, lived fairly harmoniously, but in moments of imperial collapse, be that the collapse of the Russian Empire or of the Soviet Union, started disputing ownership of territory, ownership of various lands, in particular this land of mountainous Nagorno-Karabakh. And this was the sudden conflict that almost out of nowhere, but was revived from the early 20th century and swept through the Caucasus in the late 1980s. And, you know, both sides, people from both sides, I should say, did terrible things. And there were this large Azerbaijani population in Armenia who was forced to leave. And Baku, in particular, had this very big Armenian population who'd lived there for generations, who'd contributed so much to the city. And within a couple of years, they were all gone, and often in very violent circumstances. And this is what Aylisli is writing about. He's writing about this from two angles: as someone who lives in Baku, writing about the present, writing about these nationalist thugs beating up and often killing his Armenian neighbors, and his horror at that. And he's also writing, looking back in the past, as someone who came from Nakhchivan, a very mixed region which used to have a big Armenian population, a big Armenian cultural heritage, all of which unfortunately got completely erased in this period. So he's looking back to the past and remembering what his grandmother told him, and also about pogroms against the Armenians of Nakhchivan in 1919. And in the nationalist fervor that swept the Caucasus, only very few people on either side were brave enough to stand up and say, this must not stand. We must take a stand against this. We must speak out against the violence. Aylisli did this in 1989. He wrote a letter to this journal, Druzhba Narodov. And then he, as it were, went quiet for a while. And, you know, if you talk to him, as I did, he says that he decided that taking a public stand during the period of the war and years afterwards was just impossible. But he tried to maintain his contacts with Armenian friends and tried to kind of maintain his contacts with Heydar Aliyev, the Azerbaijani president, and do what he could behind the scenes. But I think over the years he saw that this, he got, I think, increasingly frustrated. There was this terrible incident in Budapest where an Azerbaijani officer murdered an Armenian officer on a NATO training course. You know, this was an appalling incident, and Aylisli again wanted to speak out against it. And again, most of Azerbaijani society wanted to kind of hush this up, or even in some cases even say this guy was a hero. And I think this was the context in which he wrote Stone Dreams, and then it was published in Moscow, as we know, in Russian in 2012. And then there was, in 2013, there was this campaign of vilification against him, which came right from the top, unfortunately. He was, and it was a bit like you read about the Dr. Zhivago case in the 50s, people writing letters saying, I have not read this book, but I am completely outraged. And of course, very few people have actually read Stone Dreams, but because of the hearsay about it, there was this campaign of vilification. People, burnt copies of the book. He was stripped of all his awards. He was stripped of his pension. His wife, who was actually, she's not even Azerbaijani, she's from Belarus, lost her job as the director of a children's library. One of his sons lost his job. The other left Azerbaijan. And he lost everything. He was, a lot of people stood up for him, particularly in Russia, I'm glad to say. People like Boris Akunin, various writers. But still there was this campaign of vilification for him, which is now almost 10 years old. And since then, he hasn't left Azerbaijan. There's a whole, which we can talk of maybe separately. There's a whole kind of Armenian side to the story about the Armenians maybe over-romanticizing him as one of them. Publishing, the book's been published, I believe, twice in Armenian. Armenians not noticing many of the nuances in the story, that this is not necessarily, it's a book which is critical of Azerbaijani narratives, but it's not necessarily embracing Armenian narratives either. And then in 2016, he was invited to the Venice Film Festival. His health has not, he's now 85, I believe, so his health was already not great. One of his sons was supposed to go with him, and they'd already were in Baku airport, and suddenly they were stopped from boarding the flight. They were taken to the police station. They sat there for several hours, and suddenly this Azerbaijani border guard was dragged in to the police station, very confused, didn't know why he was there. And then he was told, and Aylisli was told, that Aylisli had assaulted this policeman, this young policeman, this 78-year-old infirm writer had allegedly assaulted this border guard, and that therefore he couldn't leave the country. This was news to the policeman. This was news, obviously, to Aylisli. They used this as a pretext to take away his travel documents. There's no court case has ever been, that was it, that was one day. The investigation was never continued, but it's never been dropped. So since then, he's had no travel documents. He's been unable to leave Baku, unable to actually go back to his home village in Nakhchivan. And he basically has spent the last few years sitting in his apartment in Baku with his son and wife, neither of whom have had jobs. And as someone who has studied the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict and who's always looked for people who would give a third narrative, a narrative which is neither the Azerbaijani nationalist narrative or the Armenian nationalist narrative, both of which lead their nations, let's be blunt about this, into a kind of cul-de-sac, historical cul-de-sac. It's very important that someone spoke up, and that was Aylisli. One or two people on the Armenian side, in less prominent ways, I think, have done it, but Aylisli is very much the most prominent person who has been a public intellectual and writer, voicing this third narrative. So I felt it was important to support him. I got in contact with him last summer. We corresponded. I wrote an article about him. And then in February, I was in Baku, and I spent a great evening with him, his son, and his wife. There's still you can hear in Catherine's reading the kind of humor, the wit, the insight of the man, and that's all there. I mean, he's quite infirm. His health is not great. He's got several health problems, not obviously helped by sitting at home all this time and by the kind of cabin fever of basically not leaving his apartment for, I think, weeks on end sometimes. But we had a great evening. We talked about things. I think my visit cheered him up for sure. But his situation is basically as was, and I raised his issue, his case with the Azerbaijani officials I met, who gave rather evasive answers. I mentioned it to foreign diplomats, several of whom actually didn't know about the case because they'd only been in Baku 2 or 3 or 4 years, and it was before their time, and it had completely disappeared from the kind of news horizon. So but you know, I think he doesn't get any older, and he again is quite blunt that he believes the strategy is to try and ignore him, try and make the world forget about him, and hope that in a few years, you know, to be blunt, he'll be dead, and they won't have to bother him about him. And I see really the duty of those who support Armenian Azerbaijani peace, which is actually making a few steps forward in the last 6 months, and those of us who support a voice of conscience, not to let that happen, to remind everyone that he's still there and that he's a voice that shouldn't be silenced.
Do you think the change in situation since the 2020 war could have affected the attitude of the Azeri authorities towards Aylisli?
Well, I would have hoped so, and I guess the best that could be said when I mentioned his name is that there wasn't a kind of stream of negative invective against him. They were sort of, I think they're trying to ignore him rather than condemn him nowadays. He said that he's now, in the last year, he's given a few interviews. Some of his earlier works have not Stone Dreams, I think for obvious reasons, because it's talking about these taboo topics like pogroms against Armenians, but other works have been published. You know, his wife was saying that you know, she noticed how his work had been purged from all libraries. Maybe he's making a comeback. So a few modest signs of progress, but earlier in the year we tried to see if he could get invitation to the Tbilisi Book Festival, where his book was coming out in Georgian, but no progress on that. So let's hope we have these negotiations now, top-level negotiations between the Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders. They've met in Brussels now 3 times. It's, you know, this conflict is incredibly intractable, incredibly difficult. No sane person would be optimistic about how it could be solved, but we have to have, as Gramsci said, you know, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, and hope that some progress can be made, and maybe a nice gesture, a cost-free gesture from the Azerbaijani government side to prove that they are a bit more serious about peace would be to lift the restrictions on Akram Aylisli, but nothing as yet.
Thanks, Tom. It's, we do have a recording of Akram Aylisli reading from his book, and we would like to play just a short clip, maybe, half a minute, because it's Azerbaijani, but I'd love to hear it, and I'm sure you will too.
Çayın dikindən üzü yuxarı, dağın döşünəcən uzanıb gedən bu nəhayətsiz hillələr, səkilər dünyası görən doğrudanmı Aylisli idi? Bu necə Aylisidir ki, onun bircə dar dərəsi birdən-birə bu dünyanın özü boyda olmuşdu. Görəsən Aylisli bu qədər böyümüşdü, yoxsa dünyanın daşdan hörmənə qədər hilləsi, səkisi var. Hamısını hər yerdən köçülüb, Aylisinin bircə dar dərəsində göz işlədikcə eninə, uzununa düzmüşdülər. Bura haradır Allah? Bəlkə Mesopotamiyadakı Babilim Allahının daş darvazasının ağzı idi. Bəlkə Akropoldu bura. Bu billələr, səkilər də bəlkə altdan yuxarı birbaşa Parfenon mabədinə tərəf gedirdi və bu göz şəkilli villələr görəsən Diyonist teatrının daş oturacaqlarına niyə bu qədər oxşuyurdu?
Yeah, well, which, you know which piece this is? Which
I do.
yes.
I will read you a little of this. This is a shorter excerpt. This piece comes at the beginning of the second chapter of Stone Dreams, and Akram Aylisli is lying in a coma in the hospital. I should just say a word about that. You were hearing that clip in Azeri. This book is not available in Azerbaijan. People who speak Azeri cannot just pick up this book and hear what you just heard. There are, shall we say, translations from the Russian back into Azeri that were made in an attempt to blacken Aylisli's name, but the book itself is not available in the language in which it was originally written. So, this is the beginning of chapter 2, and it begins, O Almighty Lord, be so kind, tell me, did you create my Aylis, or did my Aylis create you? O Lord, what is this place? Could this world of steps stretching from the steep bank of the river up along the slope of the mountain really have existed in Aylis? What on earth was that Aylis, where a single narrow gorge suddenly became enormous like the world? Is it really possible that Aylis grew so great? Or did someone collect all the steps carved of stone and all the ledges of the world and arrange them as far as the eye could see in that same narrow gorge of Aylis? What is this place, oh my God? Perhaps it's the mouth of Babylon's Ishtar Gate in Mesopotamia, or the Acropolis. Perhaps these steps and ledges lead straight up to the Parthenon. And why do these curved steps remind one so much of the stone seats in the theater of Dionysus? Perhaps this stone world in the higher part of Aylis named Voragurd can be called harmony. But for the moment, it's impossible to say, because from the stone ledge on which Sadai Sadigli stands, not a single stone of the church located in Voragurd can yet be seen. That's an Armenian church, by the way. Besides, he'd come to this mysteriously wonderful world specifically in search of harmony. And if what the artist beheld was indeed harmony, then didn't his entire path beyond lose all meaning? In order to catch even a distant glimpse of that place toward which the artist was striving, he'd have to clamber up the stone steps for a long time still. But his legs refused to go, his hands wouldn't obey, and the heaviness in his head interfered with the movement of his body. As soon as the artist managed to climb just one step, then and there his strength deserted him. Then Sadai Sadigli would lie on the cold ledge, recover a bit, and again began to move towards the majestic church built from hewn red stone that still wasn't visible. And each time he began to move, the ledges towering over him started to move too. In this stone world made up of steps stretching from the bank of the river to the very heavens, the earth quaked, the ledges began to rock and shake, and along with that shaking and rocking stone world, Sadai Sadigli once more completely forgot where he was and what he was looking for, plunging into the absolute darkness of nothing and nowhere.
Beautiful. I mean, it's so poetic in Azerbaijani. It doesn't lose anything in English at all. You know, it's like a great poem. Before I sort of go to Tom to sort of finalize, but my quick question is, as a Russian and Azeri speaker and grown up on both cultures, I sometimes see that bits are sometimes, you know, or not just ideas, but the feeling is getting lost in translation sometimes. How did you feel that you're translating from Russian, not Azerbaijani, you know, as is, with this particular book?
So I was lucky that this translation into Russian was made by Akram Aylisli himself. So even though I wasn't working in the original language, I was working with the original author, and I was able to communicate with him. We wrote back and forth whenever there was a problem or something that I didn't know myself. And furthermore, this book, you asked me earlier what was the hardest part. The hardest part of this book is that it is about Azerbaijan, Armenia, the history of both cultures, the foods of both cultures, and not just those cultures, the spurious mythologies made up about both of those cultures by each of those peoples, and not just those peoples. Aylis itself is located on the ancient Silk Road, and so there were huge, caravans of people of all different cultures coming through and leaving traces of themselves and their languages, their foods in this little mountain village. And and I'm not an expert on the Caucasus. My background and training was in Soviet studies and in Russian. So I was very fortunate that there's a series editor for Academic Studies Press who was able to look at my translation and help with some of those things. There is a completely made-up mythology at a certain point in the book that pretends that there were no Armenians ever in this particular part of Azerbaijan. And so it went on and on and on and on, and I'm thinking there's something not quite right about this, but it was with the help of the series editor who knows the area and knows the cultures better than I that we were able to bring that part of the translation into English. So I think it was the unfamiliarity, and also, honestly, there are words in Persian, there are words in Georgian, I think there are words in Azeri, there are words in Armenian, and they were all filtered through the Russian of the Soviet period. So you had to kind of scrape back to what this was originally, and we finally made the very difficult decision with the series editor that we weren't going to scrape all the Russian out of there. In other words, this was how the author translated it into Russian. We wanted to preserve that, and so all the names that have to do with names for Armenian or Azeri customs or foods, they have that layer of Russian over them because that's how the author presented them to me, and we went as far back as we felt we could without violating that spirit. But it was an interesting translation question. How do you keep those layers of culture, and at the same time the fact that it was all run through the Soviet version of Russian, right, or post-Soviet?
And also, when I read this words like Parapiyat, Armenikent, I know exactly which part of Baku he's talking about, and which is and my probably last question is to Tom to just say the Russian connection, the famous wording that "Rukopisi не горят," in the manuscript don't burn, very much works well in this particular case of Akram's book, but where do you see the Russian connection and the Russian could the fact that it was published in Druzhba Narodov basically, but it was Soviet Union, I understand that, but or was past Soviet Union, the fact that Russia is involved somehow, could it help to the fate of this book to be returned into Azerbaijani?
Yeah, obviously we're in 2022. We're looking at Russia a bit differently, but for sure the Russian connection up until now, I would say, has been a positive one. Aylisli has been criticized for being too Russophile. He himself said that he used to be an Azerbaijani nationalist, but he's also said, in the modern world, I could, as a poor boy from a small Azerbaijani village, I would never have made it to study Moscow, but in the Soviet Union I could, at the Soviet Union of the 50s, and I'm grateful for that. And the Soviet Union did give advantages to poor people from the provinces, from the villages, and he's part of this group of village writers, some of whom, like Belov, became rather nationalist in Russia. The Armenian equivalent, who was his great friend, who died, I think, in 2002, is Hrant Mativosyan, who, if you haven't seen the film, in English it's called We and Our Mountains, Muy I Nashi Gory. It's a wonderful classic Armenian film from the 60s, based on a novella by Hrant Mativosyan, and he's the kind of, I would guess, the Armenian equivalent of Aylisli, and the two of them were friends. So I think for him, he's got a more benign view of Russia than a lot of people in the Caucasus, I think, formed by that experience of the 1950s and that group. of Soviet writers that he got to know, including Armenians, and which would not have really been possible anywhere but Moscow, and how they worked together, and this journal, Druzhba Narodov. So I think that's is one layer of the kind of Aylisli story. It's not only about the village, is about Nakhchivan, which I think is his kind of core identity, this region of Nakhchivan. It's also about that kind of Soviet, more positive side of Soviet experience, in which different nationalities were able to rub up against one another in Soviet times.
Thank you, Tom. I think the Azeri authorities always had a bit of an issue with some writers, definitely with literature. If you remember Chingiz Guseynov, one of the leading Azeri writers, having to leave Azerbaijan in the 70s, and Maksud Ibragimbekov, or even 50s, and that Maksud Ibragimbekov leaving in the 70s and then coming back. Sorry, not Maksud, Rustam Ibragimbekov, his brother Maksud stayed. But I hope that Akram Aylisli will return in shape and form, whichever, and his books will be back on the shelves. Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much, Catherine. If there are any questions you'd like to ask, go ahead.
Two very pedestrian questions. First of all, what is the print run of this book?
It's just come out, and I don't know the answer. It's the American publisher is a small publisher.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a pity they don't put a tirage.
I know. Yeah, we don't do that in America.
Well, one's just curious to know, how many people will be able to lay their hands on it. The second question is, if neither this wonderful Mr. Aylisli, nor his wife, nor his son are working, how was their food on the table when you visited? I mean, how are they living?
I think he does have a pension. I think he lost some of his special privileges, which you had as from the Writers' Union, but I think he does have a pension. They do. Their other son, who I think was actually living in Minsk, as far as I could see, and was also providing for them. But yeah, I mean, they as I say, they have a bit of cabin fever. They just living in this apartment in Baku and not going anywhere. So it's not a. It is a life, but it's not a very satisfying or luxurious life that they lead, for sure.
Well, he sounds like a wonderful man.
I can clarify that also, that it was the special presidential pension that was stripped, but his ordinary pension as an older man from the Soviet period, yes, he still has that. Yeah.
Good. Thank you.
I have one question. You've talked a lot about the perception of Akram's work in Azerbaijan, but I'm wondering how he's regarded in Armenia, and has the book been translated in Armenian?
Yes, I can take that one. I think it's an important issue because the book was, I think, has been published in 2 Armenian editions and was much read. And I think he intended it as a conversation with Armenians. As I said, it's sad that his main interlocutor was this writer, Hrant Mativosyan, who's no longer with us, unfortunately. And I think some Armenian intellectuals have responded, which is positive, and treating this as a conversation about how we need to kind of revisit what happened to us, this kind of catastrophe that visited us, both nations of ours, in the end of the 1980s and the 1990s. But obviously there's a kind of cruder propagandistic element, unfortunately, that many Armenians just saw this, Azerbaijani writer apologizes for pogroms against Armenians, and only seeing it in that light, and that's obviously unfortunate. I think it is unfortunate that there is no one. There are various Armenian writers, but there's no one quite of that stature in Armenia to kind of be the other side of that conversation. There are a few people, and I think many Armenians would be glad to pick up that conversation, but there's no one really. I mean, you know, Aylisli was a big, Famil can confirm this, but he was a big figure in Azerbaijan. You know, he was his, I hope Catherine could say a word or two about his early work, which you're still seeking, you'd love to translate, as I understand, but you know, they published in, talking about tirages in hundreds of thousands in the 60s and in the Soviet Union. So yeah.
And Eastern Europe in over 30 languages.
Yeah, so
millions and millions and millions.
You know, there are Armenian intellectuals and writers, but no one quite of that comparable stature. You know, that's a conversation, hopefully, that maybe there's some younger writers who would pick up that conversation with Aylisli in Armenia.
This is possibly a very ignorant question that tells you how little I know about the Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict, but it seems that certainly now that Russia is supporting Azerbaijan with the last aggression, that they had support somehow from Russia or from Russian weapons or something. So how does it work that he is kind of popular in Russian, translates himself into Russian, but the Azerbaijani government is repressing him so much?
Well, let me try and pick that up. Yeah, it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, Russia has a close and I would say closer relationship with Armenia, a military alliance. Armenia is part of the Eurasian Economic Union with Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan. Russia has a very strong influence in Armenia, which isn't to say it's the only influence, but Russia is the kind of main partner of Armenia. But Russia plays double games, or even triple games in its neighborhood, as we know. And also Russia has quite a strong relationship in a different kind with Azerbaijan, on the presidential level, on the elite level. And Russia certainly, you know, when the 2020 war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Russia sort of sat on the sidelines, did nothing, and then came in at the last minute to insert its peacekeeping force and sort of suddenly insert itself in the conflict. So Russia is both, you know, is many things. It's patron of both. It's the peacemaker. It's the arms supplier of both. It's the instigator of conflict on another level. And then, of course, if we're talking about the Russian cultural elite, they're a more benign presence, as you know, and a more positive presence for sure. Anything to add?
No, just Tom is absolutely right about the elite connections, and also you have to remember that we're talking about Azerbaijan sort of returning the lands rather than fighting for no man's land, basically. So that is seen in a totally different light. And the moment the Azeri army was threatening to overrun the Karabakh itself, the Armenian sort of center of Karabakh, the Stepanakert or Khankendi, as Azeris call it, then the Russians stepped in. And from what the Azeri officials were telling me, they've been basically made an offer they couldn't refuse. And that was to have Russian peacekeepers in there, and then the Armenians will give back the surrounding regions that have been seized for 20 odd years, over 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's very important, yeah. Obviously, we've been focusing on the horrible violence against Armenians, but we mustn't forget that in the Karabakh War, in terms of numbers, the largest number of victims were Azerbaijanis who were displaced. I mean, there were many Armenian victims of that war as well. Everyone suffered, but more than 500,000 Azerbaijanis were displaced from these territories by these Armenian fighting and actions in the 1990s. So, as Famil said, the 2020 war, which I think was avoidable, but it was also in large part a war of reconquest of those territories.
I know that if you're a writer who is sort of bilingual Russian from a Soviet Union sort of background, maybe it doesn't make any difference. But I just wondered if as a translator translating him from Russian, maybe it's impossible for you to tell if you don't know Azeri, but what the difference might be, or whether you pick up on any differences there.
So I keep asking, because I cannot find the source of this quotation, but I read it somewhere way back when I was first starting to work on this, that Akram Aylisli told a journalist somewhere, somehow, that he preferred his version of his own book in Russian to his version in Azeri. And I have asked and asked and asked Azeri speakers, and even in America, thousands and thousands of miles away from all of this, people don't want to admit that they've read this book, and they don't really want to talk about it. But eventually, someone will say, well, Azeri is a much more formal, flowery language, and we should ask Famil, who actually speaks both of them. But that's the answer that I've been given, that it's because it's a more formal, and perhaps artificial is not the right word, but flowery.
I mean, I second that. The Azeri language is much more suitable for poetry, as they used to say, than for prose, which I don't really support, because you can do both. But even when Akram Aylisli is reading on screen his own prose, it sounds like a poem, and that's what makes you think, the difference between the Russian and the Azeri. We, as journalists, we used to have this. These jokes with our Azeri counterparts. We used to work for a Russian newspaper, and Azeri counterpart with Azeri newspaper. But when we would go and cover the same event, the result would be starkly different. When the Russian report will be quick, not too laconic maybe, but quite quick. But the Azeri would start with a long intro and go into the sort of exactly in the flowery way. It's a style rather than the quality of the language. The language is suitable for any possible. It's a tool. It's suitable for many things.
I will just say another word about that. One of the tricks that translators from Russian use, because Russian has a case system and an inflected language, the sentences can go on and on and on and on. So one of the standard tools of I don't know about British translators, but certainly American translators, is you break the sentence up, because it just goes on forever. So, of course, I went charging into this book, these long, long, long sentences. And by the way, his Russian is fairly formal and ornate, as opposed to, say, Anna Starobinets, whom I also translate. She writes in short, staccato, almost journalistic sentences. But his goes on and on forever. And I kept trying to break up the sentences, because, half a page, nobody wants to read that. What I found, though, is his writing is absolutely full of the classical figures of speech. Anaphora, anacrusis, all of the things that go back to Aristotle, that's setting up, climax and these long multi-part sentences, and you can't break up the sentences without destroying the beautiful logic that he's put them together, with which he's put them together. So that was a huge challenge, and one of the reviews of this translation, I think it's maybe my favorite review, because he says it sounds slightly old-fashioned. That's what the Russian sounds like. And even though that may not be most appealing to readers today, I feel like that's what I wanted to capture. That he's an older man writing in this beautiful older style of Russian, and it is a little bit, not antiquated, but just a little, maybe the way we read Jane Austen, just there's something just a little bit ornate.
You should keep in mind that the man graduated from Maxim Gorky Literature Institute in Moscow at a certain historical stage, and he had been taught by certain people who would be exactly having that attitude, that sort of approach, an old man's approach to how you sort of build this up, the whole sentence, and it goes long, long, long waves.
the extract you read, sorry, just to say, was had some of that ornateness, but also this kind of slightly touching, slightly ironic. How could you possibly not have heard of this actor? And the way that the people talk to each other within the dialogue has also got some of that old-fashionedness. I don't know how to describe it.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, the reason he went to the Gorky Literary Institute in Moscow in the 50s, where he studied, I think, with Yevtushenko and that generation, Yevtushenko, Akhmadulina, is he went as a poet. And his first publications were poetry, and then he turned to prose fairly soon thereafter. So that's his background as well.
And also I have to say that, I mean, I imagine every single dialogue in that book, I imagine Azerbaijani, because that's how it sounds to me. It's just that, what, you haven't heard the actor? No, you know, it just goes, straight in.
Well, Baku Russian is a sort of language in itself. Even someone doesn't speak Azeri. When I hear people speak Russian in Baku, it has a certain music to it, which I don't hear in other dialects of Russian. They also they also have this wonderful intonation, which always goes up. They seem to always constantly asking the rhetorical question "da" at the end of the sentence. Yeah.
Tom started talking like that at home.
Ty mnie lubisz, da?
Thank you very much for your questions. If there are any more, no?
Can you just say a couple of words about Люди и дерева, people and trees?
Yes, because that is a project close to my heart. So that is the book I showed you earlier, Farewell Alice, is the later trilogy of Akram Aylisli's life. And most of these novellas are set from 1990 or later. But the earlier trilogy is called People and Trees. It's also available in Russian, and I spoke about it a little bit earlier. It's set immediately during and after the Second World War in the village of what stands in for Alice. It's the story of a young boy who's raised by women and the trials and tribulations of that woman, his aunt, going through the Second World War. It is a beautiful piece of writing. It was written, I believe, in the late 1960s. It is almost a proto-feminist work. It is really looking at the world in a way that you perhaps don't expect from an Azeri man of his generation, and very sympathetic to women, telling their stories, the difficulties they face when the soldiers come home. He tells the story of one particular woman who was very proud to walk with her face uncovered down the street so that she could show her black eye. Why? Because that meant she had a living man in her life. So it just really remarkable stories of what it was like to be a woman during this period and go through the cataclysm first of the Soviet power and then the losses of the war, famine, and so much else. So that book, I am still looking for people to support that translation, and I'm looking for a publisher, but I'm hoping very much to have that happen soon because it's a marvelous work. It ought to be out in the world. Azerbaijan, as I say, for Americans, is a long, long way, but it's not so far away from you here in Britain. So I'm hoping to find an audience for this book. You would think, you walk into any group of intellectuals or lovers of literature and you say, here is a man whose books were burned in his own country. To me, that's enough to say, at least I ought to look at those books and see what made them burned, what made someone so angry. But I think when we emphasize the political content of this writer, which is certainly true of Stone Dreams, it is in some ways a very political book, but we are really doing him a disservice because he is a wonderful writer. He is a tremendous, beautiful, gifted writer, and I don't think I would spend years of my life trying to translate somebody simply because of his political opinions, no matter how worthy. I'm interested in the language. I'm interested in the way it sounds. I'm interested in working with the depth of the literary creation that he's made. Certainly other countries, many other countries, people know his work. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize, the Peace Prize, by the way, in 2014, because of this book of what it has to say about the Azeri and Armenian conflict. But he's also well worthy of literary prizes because and has been nominated for quite a number of them because of the quality of the beautiful writing. So people tend to disparage village prose, which is a particular movement associated with Soviet writers. I can't speak to that at large, but this work stands on its own in an international context, and maybe that's part of the reason that I'm so anxious to have more people read it, because it's just beautiful literature. I don't care about the politics so much.
Sorry. I mean, I came here through reading Hamid Ismailov. And there seems quite a lot of similarities between the two writers. Ismailov also studied in Moscow and then went back to Uzbekistan and started writing. And was also suffered under the regime and finally had to leave. Would you like to give your take on any of that?
So I don't know Ismailov as well as I should, but my friend Shelley Fairweather-Vager translates him. Gaia, Queen of the Ants was the latest work that she did, and I've heard him speak. There's a generational difference, obviously. Ismailov is how old is he?
Hamid, you mean Hamid? Yeah?
Hamid.
Ismailov.
Yeah. Maybe in his...
He's just over 60.
Okay.
Slightly older than me.
So that's a quarter-century difference right there. But I think you're not mistaken in the sense that people who have a wide imagination cannot really be confined by where they live or where they go to school. They're people, they're creatures of the universe, right? And certainly artists are, to my mind, international people. And their imaginations cross borders. And I think one of the sad things that we find in conflicts like the Armenian and Azerbaijani conflict, for example, is that how many people, and this isn't just specific to that conflict, but how many people are willing to diminish themselves and their gifts to be propagandas, mouthpieces for a particular ideology. We're finding it, I think, also in Russia and Ukraine, honestly, where people are willing to subjugate their art to politics. Obviously, any good work of art is political, but to toe a particular line, a political line, at the expense of your art is very sad. And I certainly Ismailov and
Right.
Aylisli, that's not what they do.
I believe that Hamid Ismailov also knows Aylisli, and I would say The Devil's Dance is also this wonderful mixture of contemporary satire and fable about the past. So I would definitely second your view that they're kind of twins in some ways. Yeah.
Although obviously one has lived internationally for many, many years now, and Akram Aylisli is very much a creature of his time and place, which is Soviet Azerbaijan.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.